Hello again, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Thursday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, let's see, we've got hazardous weather graphic, one more warning area to go till it's all over for, well, a short time anyway, for tonight, tomorrow. Anyway, winter storm warning continues until midnight for the upper Tanana Valley and 40 Mile Country there, Northway up to Eagle over Delta Junction area. And that's for a storm total of 8 to 12 inches of snow with winds gusting to 25 miles an hour. That should maybe reduce visibilities to a half mile or less where the winds are blowing. They're the strongest. And at this point, only about maybe another half inch to inch of snow additional is expected, but those winds keeping the visibilities on the low side. And again, that's out until midnight tonight, may even end sooner with the conditions improving by the hour. Otherwise, moving on to the southeast coast, northern panhandle, high wind watch out that kicks into effect. It's again a watch that starts late Friday and continues through Sunday night, and that's for Skagway and downtown Juneau. And they're looking for northeast winds 30 to 40 miles per hour, gusts to 60 miles per hour. Again, possible. And also, very cold temperatures will be in place throughout the time frame there, leading to possible wind chills of 15 to 25 below zero beginning late Saturday night. Colder wind chills are likely near White Pass. And moving on to satellite imagery. See the massive clouds that brought the third round of heavy snow across areas of south central Alaska and into the Copper River Basin and then on up into the eastern interior. That dissipating, moving off to the east pretty rapidly. Still some lingering light snow over the Copper River Basin, a little bit of precip, but all in the decreasing mode. In fact, actually ended Prince William Sound, just some leftover clouds there for the Kenai Peninsula into Kodiak Island area. And otherwise clearing and much colder temperatures, especially north and west of the Alaska Range, below zero into the afternoon hours, with falling temperatures actually falling below zero into the northern Kuskokwim Valley and single numbers down across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta area, and temperatures starting to fall slowly, even due to the clearing over south central Alaska into the Mananuska-Susitna Valley areas. And Arctic Village, well below zero, I think it was 37 below last time I checked up there, with light winds, clear skies, some clouds and flurries along the Arctic coast there. And you can see a lot of clouds streaming north and northwestward there into the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, bringing some areas of light rain and milder temperatures. Rainfall not particularly heavy, but winds gusting with that system there, pretty gusty winds, and then a weaker system out to the west, so the bulk of that moisture heading up into Russia. Today you can see the strong area of high pressure building over the Bering Strait and extending into the western interior and also over the northeast interior as snow ends over the southeast part of the state, with that frontal boundary along and just north of the North Gulf Coast, still having some rain in the Cordova area. They picked up about just under 9/10 of an inch in the last 12 hours, and Yakutat had about 1.06 inches of precipitation, and much lighter amounts, mixed precipitation over the Panhandle, and rain and wind pushing into the Aleutians there. Peak wind gusts 55 miles an hour out of the east at Nikolsky, and even St. George Island had northeast winds gusting to 51 miles per hour. Unalaska had a peak wind gust of 46 miles per hour. For tonight, occasional rain and warmer temperatures, windy conditions, mild temperatures, at least by comparison to the interior for the Alaska Peninsula and the central western Aleutians up to St. Paul. Clearing and colder, temperatures falling well below zero, anywhere from 20 to 40 below for the overnight lows tonight over the northern interior and even into the central interior there. It should stay above zero for the most part for south central Alaska, areas east and south of the Alaska Range there, with increasing winds gusting to about 35 miles an hour today at Seward. That'll continue into tonight, and actually the gradient tightening up there for the Matanuska Valley, Copper River Basin, and eventually the North Gulf Coast, and eventually the Panhandle. That area of moisture I got drawn over the southeast coast, that's going to slide off to the southeast, and actually by tomorrow afternoon should be just about out of the area there with clearing skies, colder air coming in on those stronger north winds. You can see that 1,060 millibar high there centered northern Koyukuk Valley near the Brooks Range. Lingering flurries for the eastern Arctic coast there. Gradient continues to tighten across southern Alaska, especially from the Susitna Valley in the North Gulf Coast into the Panhandle. Not much change out west. Mild east-southeast flow keeps periods of rain possible for the Alaska Peninsula, likely for the eastern central Aleutians, and a chance of for the Pribilofs, but that'll definitely be in the form of rain out there. Maybe some snow reaching St. Matthew Island, but dry for St. Lawrence Island. And for the outlook, first day of the weekend, strong high pressure, 1,064 millibars, that's very high, moves into right over the Yukon there, Dawson area, and that very tight gradient. Look for possible storm force wind gusts for the Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay area as cold air, Arctic air pushes all the way down into Dixon Entrance and the Queen Charlottes. Winds won't be as strong down over the southern areas as in the north, but North Gulf Coast will see quite strong outflow winds through the gaps like the Copper River Delta, channeled areas of Prince William Sound, and lesser for south central Alaska, but temperatures starting to fall Saturday night in the 30 to 50 degree below zero range for the eastern interior, and probably holding that way into next week and it stays dry and cold over all of the interior down into Bristol Bay. Will be dry, not quite as cold there, and wet and windy for the Alaska Peninsula. Could see some moderate amounts of rain there from Cold Bay, False Pass to the eastern Aleutians on Alaska, and rain and gusty winds for the Pribilofs. Looking at lows for tonight, it's still mild there, dropping a little below freezing for the northern panhandle there up around Skagway, maybe Haines down to 30, otherwise mid to upper 30s, upper 20s for the North Gulf Coast, and down to 20, 25 below in the Kuskokwim Valley in the north, milder in the south, about 20 below in the Copper River Basin. Lows 5 below to 5 above. South central Alaska, 15 for Homer, near 20 for Seward with gusty north winds. 0 to 5 for Bristol Bay, near 30. Kodiak, highs tomorrow mid-30s Kodiak Island, and 30s to near 40 for the southeast coast. Staying well below zero in the Copper River Basin and the Kuskokwim Valley. Highs right around 10 for the south central Alaska area and the Kenai Peninsula, milder down toward the coast. Mid-30s for Kodiak Island, and upper teens for Bristol Bay. Lows on Saturday morning, 20 to 30 below or so for the northern Kuskokwim Valley. 10 to 20 below down to the south. Single numbers there for the King Salmon area, Dillingham, 11, call it for Iliamna. 40 degrees below zero for the Copper River Basin area around Gulkana, maybe even colder for McCarthy, 40 to 45 below. And below zero, 5 to 20 below. South central Alaska, Susitna Valley, Kenai Peninsula, and Homer down to 9. Teens in the Panhandle, 20s along the coast. Highs for Saturday afternoon, below zero Copper River Basin, single numbers. South central Alaska near 40 Kodiak, much colder in the northern Panhandle, down to the mid-teens for your afternoon highs Saturday. Staying below freezing all the way down to Dixon Entrance. Up to the north, cold. Lows tonight, well, 30 to 40 below over the northeast interior, followed by highs 15 to 30 below, followed by lows 25 to 50 below for the eastern interior, and a little bit milder, or a lot milder out toward the Bering Strait, followed by highs staying well below zero central eastern part of the state, Arctic coast, and in the mid-20s for St. Lawrence Island. And out to the southwest, 5 to 15 along the southwest coast, Nunivak Island, upper 20s for the Pribilofs, and much milder there for the Aleutians, mid to upper 30s. Highs tomorrow, lower to mid-40s, maybe 46 for Unalaska, near 40 for St. Paul and Shimia, mid-40s for the Alaska Peninsula, teens to lower 20s for the southwest coast, and then low Saturday morning, 5 to 15 for the southwest coastal areas, but staying mild for the Alaska Peninsula, upper 30s to lower 40s, near 40 for the Aleutians, mid-30s for the Pribilofs, followed by highs well into the 40s over the central and western Aleutians, lower 40s Alaska Peninsula, 20 to 25 southwest coast.
And And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
First line weather graphic. A lot of VFR now taking over the interior. Northern Bering Sea as well. Some marginal VFR, eastern North Slope, central eastern Arctic coast, and still lingering marginal VFR over the south, over toward the border there, over the southeast interior. IFR late tonight into early tomorrow morning for the northern panhandle, and some IFR for the Alaska Peninsula, Fox Islands to about Atka, northward to the Pribilofs. And for Friday afternoon, let's see, there we go. Marginal VFR south coast of Kodiak Island and covering Sitkinak Island, but improving there over the panhandle. Northern areas becoming VFR, and even improving on down to the south as well throughout the day. Interior, good VFR, but north of the Brooks Range there, the Arctic coast, central and east side, marginal and IFR conditions there. And some marginal VFR staying mostly off the coast, could just graze the Cape Lisburne Point Hope area. But VFR, Bering Strait to St. Lawrence Island, IFR for the Pribilofs, central eastern Aleutians to the western Alaska Peninsula. And for Saturday morning, again, marginal VFR for the eastern Arctic coast and part of the eastern North Slope. Good VFR, all of the interior under strong high pressure and offshore flow, keeping the marginal VFR well off the North Gulf Coast and to the west of the Panhandle, but still some possible marginal VFR there over toward Misty Fjords and Stewart Hyder area. Kodiak Island, marginal VFR possible along the, for Fognak Island in the eastern part of the island to Sitkinak, with the IFR staying out to the west there over the Bering Sea, and from about Kiska eastward to almost Sand Point there on the southern coast of the Alaska Peninsula, as well as the Pribilofs. And for Saturday afternoon, not much change out west, not much change in the interior as well, except less marginal VFR there on the eastern Arctic coast. Solid VFR for the Panhandle, and again, strong offshore flow, east-northeast flow, keeping marginal VFR well off the coast, both the North Gulf Coast, well to the west of the Panhandle, but pushing it into the east side of Kodiak Island. Otherwise, marginal VFR may catch southern Togiak Bay, Cape Newenham area. Passes, Anatuvik and Anigan, both VFR through the weekend, and into the first day of the weekend. The next 2 days, Lake Clark and Merrill, same forecast, VFR for rainy and windy Friday, VFR probably Saturday as well. And Isabel, good VFR, either approach, wide open from Antasta, Tanita VFR, Portage VFR, Chilkoot and White becoming VFR. And for the freezing levels, tomorrow morning or late tonight, early tomorrow morning, 2,000 feet, still nudged up into southern Cook Inlet and across the northern Panhandle, and 4,000 to 6,000 feet across Kodiak Island, 4,000 to 6,000 for the eastern Aleutians. Taking a look at icing free for the interior, eastern Bering Sea areas. Could be some diminishing icing there over the southeast coast, possibly mixed light icing there. 2,000 to 8,000 feet will be pushing off to the east-southeast throughout the day. And then with the southerly flow and southeasterly flow out over the Bering Sea, quite a fetch of moisture there. So isolated moderate rime icing, western Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians to about Adak, northward across the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island. And then the next band just coming near the Komodorsky Islands tomorrow and tomorrow afternoon, but staying west of Shimianet too. And for the jet stream, tomorrow, high pressure building aloft right along the west coast, centering over the Alaska Peninsula. Southerly flow, 70 to 85 knots there across the Bering Sea. Turn westerly, and then a strong northwest jet, north-northwest jet, coming down out of the Arctic across the central Arctic coast up to 105 knots. Turning more northwesterly and cutting across the northern Panhandle. 9,000 feet, 50 to 55 knot northwest winds from northern Prince William Sound down across the southern southeast coast, north at 40, eastern North Slope, southerlies up to 50 knots over the Bering Sea. 3,000 foot wind flow, not too bad over the Panhandle and most of the interior, although some easterlies, 35 to 45 knots there blowing across the lower Yukon River and Delta out to the coast, and 50 knot southeasterly winds for the eastern Aleutians. Turbulence-wise, Considerable moderate turbulence from northern Cook Inlet, all the North Gulf Coast, and into the northern Panhandle, as well as the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, and St. Lawrence Island.
Happy solstice, winter wanderers. I'm Trace. The winter solstice is Thursday, December 21st. Darkness fans, rejoice! This is the time when the northern hemisphere experiences the longest nights and shortest days. It's also deep winter constellation time. Hit the darkness at 4 a.m. and look for red Mars in the west. To its left is Orion the Hunter with his sparkly belt stars, but on the longest night of the year, we're going to find Auriga the Charioteer. To the upper right of Orion, Auriga is the pentagon shape, with the most famous star being Capella here. Capella is a quadruple star system that is so bright that ancient Oaxacans built structures aligned with its rising. Legends say that Auriga was the inventor of the four-horse chariot, or a goat herder, depending on who you ask. But speaking of goats, Auriga also has the kids, a tiny asterism near Capella forming a cute little triangle. Enjoy the solstice and keep looking up.
Tsunamis are a big threat not only to Alaska but around the Pacific because we have a lot of really big fault lines, and when they move in big earthquakes, they often move the water around them, and that's what causes tsunamis. I am Summer Ohlendorf, and I'm the science officer at NOAA's National Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer, Alaska. Alaska's main tsunami threat is from the subduction zone that lays along the southern end of the state. When an earthquake happens underneath the ocean at one of these subduction zones, the edge of one of the tectonic plates ends up kind of flipping up as stress is released at that plate boundary. And when it flips up, it pushes up the water that sits on top of it, and it moves a whole lot of water all at once. And that water all then becomes part of the tsunami wave. Just like when you throw a rock into a pond, you get a series of ripples that head outward from where the rock landed. Tsunami waves travel outward from the disturbance caused by the earthquake. And that means you can get multiple waves, and they're really long waves that can last for hours. Tsunami waves can be hundreds of miles long from one crest to the next crest. And that means that those crests, or the tops of the two waves, can come in 20 minutes apart to an hour apart. In the deep ocean, tsunami waves are actually usually pretty small. They can be anywhere from a few centimeters to maybe a meter, depending on how far offshore you are. As tsunami waves approach the coast, they kind of pile up on each other, and the energy gets compressed, so they grow in size and they slow down a lot as the wave is squeezed into a smaller space. If you're standing on the beach and a tsunami may be coming, you may hear strange noises like an approaching freight train. You may also see water being sucked away from the shore much further than it would for a low tide, and much faster. And sometimes you can hear things like rattling of sand and rocks. So just being alert for any strange ocean behavior and strange noises is always a good idea when you're near the coast. Most likely you're not going to see something like a huge 100-foot breaking wave as a tsunami approaches. It's probably going to look something more like a step of water that's maybe a few feet high, or just a turbulent mass of water. And it may not be very big, but it's going to be moving pretty fast, and it's going to be probably carrying a lot of debris with it. Even what we think of as small tsunamis can be really dangerous because they're associated with a lot of energy and a lot of fast-moving water. The National Tsunami Warning Center is part of NOAA and the National Weather Service. At the Tsunami Warning Center, we're monitoring streams from seismic data and sea level data 24/7 every day of the year. So the seismic data tells us how the Earth is moving, it tells us when there are earthquakes, and using that data we can figure out where the earthquakes are, how big they are, and how deep they are. which tells us something about the tsunami hazard from those quakes. So as far as monitoring water levels, there's something called the DART system. That stands for Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis. And what those are little stations where there's a pressure sensor on the ocean floor and a buoy anchored nearby. The way it knows the difference between a normal ocean swell and a tsunami is mostly because of the wavelength. And when we look at the signal from a DART system, we can see those big long waves and distinguish them from other smaller transient waves. Our system of coastal tide gauges is also distributed worldwide and all across the ocean basins. And what these end up telling us is what the tsunami wave is doing at the coastline. We send out an information statement when there's an earthquake near one of our coastlines that doesn't pose a tsunami hazard. We also have the tsunami watch that may be issued for a faraway earthquake that has the potential to impact one of our coastlines. A tsunami warning is our most serious level, and that is the case where we would want people to evacuate from the coastline. If you hear a tsunami warning, you'll want to evacuate from that hazard zone to travel to a safe shelter or just anywhere that's inland or higher ground outside of the hazard zone. Ahead of time, you'll want to think about where to go, what to take, and how you'll communicate with your friends and family members once you get there. It's important to remember that during a tsunami evacuation, a lot of people are going to be crowded onto the same routes trying to evacuate. During a tsunami warning, you may hear about it over the TV and radio, an alert on your cell phone. You can also see tsunami information directly on our website, www.tsunami.gov. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter, where we issue our alerts during the event.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving into marine weather forecasts. Starting up for the northern inner channels, winds become north, increasing slowly to about 30 knots with seas building to 7 feet, and those winds will increase further Friday night. Otherwise, central inside waters, south winds 20 knots, clearance straight, north at 15. For the south coast, west-northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, and north to northwest winds at 25 knots for the north coast. Moving on to the first day of the weekend. Much stronger winds, almost storm force northerlies there for Lynn Canal, and probably will be storm force gusts as much colder air flows in on those winds. Small craft advisories, north winds 30 knots for Stevens Passage, and clearance straight, winds swinging around to the north at about 20 knots. Small craft advisories on the south coast, north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, and northeasterly gales at 40 knots on the north coast. For Prince William Sound, Friday, north winds 20 knots, north winds 25 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, and the western North Gulf Coast only northeast at 15, north 15 for the Barren Islands, southern Cook Inlet and Kamishak Bay, northeast winds 30 knots, seas 9 to 10 feet, northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 15. And for Saturday, northern Cook Inlet, light winds out of the northeast at 10 knots with small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, northeast 25 in those areas. East winds 25 knots for the North Gulf Coast and the Barren Islands, northeast at 15 for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island, northeast winds 15 to 25 knots for the day Friday. Alaska Peninsula, east winds 25 to 30 knots, and for Bristol Bay, winds will be out of the northeast at 30 knots. Then for Saturday, gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula. East winds 35 to 40 knots, northeast at 30 knots for Bristol Bay, seas at about 7 feet. Kodiak Island, east-northeast winds 25 to 30 knots with 8 to 9 foot seas. And for the eastern and central Aleutians, Friday, small craft advisories, east winds 25 to 30 knots, strongest around Unalaska Island, with seas running 10 to 15 feet. Western Aleutians, east-northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the first day of the weekend, gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians, east winds 30 to 35 knots, central Aleutians east at 30 knots, and for the western Aleutians, winds swing around to the northwest at 30 knots with 15-foot seas. For the southwest coast, on Friday, east winds 30 knots. Pribilof Islands, east winds 30 knots with seas at 12 feet. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, east winds 35 knots. And gale warnings also for St. Lawrence Island, east winds increasing to 40 knots, seas building to 14 feet. And for the day Saturday, southwest coast, east winds at 30 knots, easterlies at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island, and east winds at 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound seeing a pickup in the winds there. Brisk wind advisories, northeast at 30 knots, and the Pribilofs have gale warnings out for Saturday for east winds at 35 knots. For the eastern Arctic coast tomorrow, gale warnings, west winds 30 to 40 knots, dropping off to 20 knots on the central coast and down to 15 for the western coast. And in the Chukchi Sea, Wales to Cape Thompson, east winds 25 knots. For Saturday, western Arctic coast, east winds 20 to 25 knots. And from Cape Thompson to Wales, east winds at 30 knots. And for the Arctic coast, variable to east winds 5 to 15 knots for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coastline. And for tonight, again, look for a weak trough to bring some gusty west winds, but coming down from what they were with some flurries, maybe areas of blowing snow. Otherwise, clearing and colder. Winter storm warnings done for the eastern interior by midnight or sooner. As strong high pressure builds into the interior, some snow possible for the Panhandle, and rain for the Aleutians. And Alaska Peninsula with rain and snow and warmer temperatures coming into the Pribilof Islands. Look for rain out west for Friday, clear and colder, well below zero over the interior, even moving down now south and east of the Alaska Range into the North Gulf Coast on those strong winds, and increasing winds for the Panhandle. Chance of snow showers. That area of snow actually slides off to the southeast, should be over by late tomorrow afternoon for the Panhandle, and then just clear, colder and windier for the Panhandle and the southeast interior. Very cold, temperatures below zero, just about all of interior Alaska. A little milder along the Bering Strait, wet and windy for the Aleutians and southern Bering Sea.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.